Previously on agentpalmer.com, Mrs. Agent Palmer is having a blind date with a book. You may want to unplug for your health and read Age of Earthquakes. And with a young child, change is constant. That's the update. This is the Palmer Files, episode 171 with Bill Sweeney, who is back because 5 years ago he sent me a graphic novel and last year he sent me a book, and I read them both in the last few months, and it's time to talk some book talk. While we get into the weeds on Mouse by Spiegelman and The Eyes of the Dragon by King, we also tangent elsewhere. Are you ready? Let's do the show!
I wanted to give you as broad a spectrum of reading suggestions as I possibly could. People seem to have problems with books that make you think. Stephen King is like more of a simple setup guy, whereas Clive Barker is like, I've got an entire world. Maybe what you need is a sampling of Stephen King that is not his horror stuff. It's a clever, simple story that he wrote for his daughter. 60 books just flashed before my eyes.
Hello and welcome to the Palmer Files. I'm your host, Jason Stershik, also known as Agent Palmer, and on this 171st episode is my friend, Bill Sweeney. He's here because over the last 5 years, he's sent me two reading recommendations, Mouse by Art Spiegelman and The Eyes of the Dragon by Stephen King. Bill's back to broaden my reading horizons as Spiegelman broadens the medium of comics and King the meaning of evil in a villain. More on those to come. Aside from those two books, what we thought of them, and a little about their origins, we'll talk about reading, plus the nature of independent art, Clive Barker, publishing, authors, banned books, being trapped by success in a genre, and is Bill ahead of the curve? Another thing of note is that both of my reviews for these books are on agentpalmer.com and were written and completed before this conversation. Just like with the Star Trek episodes I record with Ed, I may soften or change my opinion or tune based on the conversation you're about to hear, but I do not retroactively change my initial reviews. They are what they are. And this is what's next. You can use them to see some progression on occasion if you like. So before we get into it, remember that if you want to discuss this episode as you listen or afterward, you can find all related ways to contact Bill and myself in the show notes. You can find whatever Bill is up to at wickedtheory.com. Don't forget you can see all of my writings and rantings on agentpalmer.com, and of course, email can be sent to thepalmerfiles@gmail.com. So without further ado, take a look. It's in a book. Bill, you sent me a graphic novel, volume 1 and 2, and a book many years apart.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
But I read them about 2 months apart, 3 months apart.
Okay, yeah. All right.
That's kind of the way it works. The first thing you sent me was the 2-volume complete collection of Mouse.
Mm-hmm.
And then, for reasons we'll get into, you sent me a Stephen King novel.
Right.
I remember.
I wanted to give you as broad a spectrum of reading suggestions as I possibly could.
Well,
any broader, and it would have been like, here's a coloring book.
I just remember you were like, I want to send you this Stephen King novel, but are you going to read it in the next 5 years? And look, let's start here. I loved Mouse, and I loved The Eyes of the Dragon, but Mouse, because of the subject matter, I just kept pushing it.
Right, yeah.
And because of that, I moved the Eyes of the Dragon right to the top of the list because I was like, I'm not going to do this to Bill again.
Well, I did tell you too. I was like, I know you keep pushing off Mouse just because of whatever, and I was like, but it's not a long read. You know what I mean? It was even if it was like, oh man,
I think it took me a week. I think it was like because
that's of your own doing. That's not a book that takes a week to read.
No. Well, I guess it depends. The reason it took me a week was because I would put it down to process. There was some stuff within it that it was like, I mean, there's been
needs to be processed sometimes.
Yeah. And there's been other books I've had that are like also maybe not graphic novels, but they're also short books, but they're heavy in some capacity. And it's just like, all right, well, yeah, I could read this in maybe half an afternoon, but it's like, I'm not reading this to read it. I'm reading it to process it, like to learn something, to experience. So it's like, all right, I gotta put this down. And that actually, I think volume 2 of Mouse took me longer than volume 1 because of the generational discussion. And it's unsaid, by the way, but the unsaid generational rift, so to speak, was a lot for me.
Yeah, I think even for me, if I remember correctly, like the second one is just there's more going on. It's the heavier probably read. It's a little longer. It might even be a little slower kind of a thing.
I also think for anyone who's creative, reading the second volume of Mouse, he's dealing with his own success. And legitimately the burden of his own success. And I think for you and me, having like attempted things before, regardless of how we define success,
right,
it's still something you carry with you. And so like he's juggling like, oh, I did this thing and it was really good. And you're like, yeah, I know what that feels like. Like that's tough. That's not, I don't think people quite, especially people that aren't in the creative spaces, I don't think they understand there is a weight to success in any definition. And popular success might be the weightiest of all successes.
Yeah.
But I suggest it for a lot of people. I've suggested Mouse since. In fact, since I read it, Kristen Meyer read volume 1 and is waiting for volume 2 to be available at her local library.
Oh, okay.
And that was apropos of nothing. Like I just saw it on her books I read last year. I was like, oh, I read that too.
Well, here's the thing, it's certainly one of those books that doesn't probably get a lot kicked around in the conversations anymore the fact that I suggested it to you and had you read it, I think it, to me, is indicative of the fact that it's kind of like out of the general conversation now because so many years have passed since it was published.
Well,
to hear that somebody else actually has it on their reading list is a little bit of a surprise, and I'm glad to hear it.
Well, what I mean? I would say you were ahead of the curve because
finally about something.
In between you gifting me that and my reading it popped up at least 3 times for me separately as books were being banned because it was always on the list. And I was like, oh, I gotta get to that at some point. And it was there were other reminders in like the weird cultural, war that's going on with banned books where it was like, it's everybody. That's one of the ones they always talk about. It's always tops of the list.
Yeah, people seem to have problems with books that make you think or make you confront ugly history. I think maybe we should frame it a little bit for anybody who's listening who's not like
familiar.
Familiar. So when we say Mouse, it's spelled M-A-U-S, and it's from, is it German actually root for that spelling? Probably German root.
It would be German for that.
And it's written by Spiegelman, came out in the 80s. Originally, he did the work that's in it over a period in the 70s, I think.
What was it in? Do you know? Like, because that's the part, like, there are definitive sections, like this is a graphic novel, a collection of other pieces. And I just keep thinking, like, it would be weird to be reading, like there in my brain canon, there's no place this fits where it's not like in Parade or in the Sunday comics or whatever. Just you come across and you're like, what?
Certainly not. So it's a comic. It's a retelling of his family's story and issues and history with the Holocaust and his interaction with his father, who was a survivor.
Yeah.
At the same time, it's telling how, like, quote unquote present day, he's trying to like connect on some of these historical things from his dad and trying to put into perspective how he was just kind of casually told things or overheard things as a child living with Holocaust survivors growing up in New York City. So yeah, not your typical comic book thing, but the comic it was printed in was an indie, obviously very indie, avant-garde kind of comic called Raw, and that serialized a bunch of different things, or from I think like weird humor to like deep heavy stuff,
Okay.
but very much in that was like in a collection book kind of a thing that came out I think every month or so, maybe not, I'm not sure of like the
Kind of like
publishing
heavy
history on
metal,
that.
where like there were some,
Right.
like there would be some things that you'd catch every month, and there'd be some things that you'd catch every so often, not every month.
Right.
Okay.
And then that material also, amongst itself in the comic ran a gamut. You know what I mean?
I gotcha.
And I think for the most part, you know what I mean? I don't think it was all like super serious stuff that was in there. I thought it was, in my recollection or understanding, it was like more like at the time, I thought it was maybe beatnik kind of stuff,
Okay.
like that kind of stuff. But it turns out probably not. But, it was indie comic stuff that was popping up in New York. And
which really, honestly, sets it apart from what I know of indie comics, because not for anything. I mean, I don't know where this comes from, but all of my indie comic knowledge comes from the West Coast, from like R. Crumb type stuff. And I know hearing you say that this is from the East Coast is like eye opening, because I was like, I didn't know we had indie comics over here. Like now, yeah, but in the 70s and 60s, like everything's focused on San Francisco.
Yeah, like that kind of art scene.
Yeah.
Does seem to be kind of like,
it's like the prevailing wind.
Yeah, the California side of things. And well, the more you know, the more you realize, well, certainly during that time, anything that was not Marvel or DC was just indie. Okay. Because those were the big two. And even like other superhero stuff made by small publishers just wasn't, available to the level because of it being from smaller publishers. Like anything could have been indie. The real, if indie stuff is stuff that's even like more like this, where it felt like, oh, did like 4 people in a garage put this together? Like, like how did this even get to a printer on time? Like, so. And then nowadays, Marvel DC is still the big two, but it's easier to say, well, maybe there's like 4 or 5 considered like the main publishers in comics now. And there's still like indie scene, but it's just, times have changed and it's harder and more expensive. And so,
well, and some of that stuff is online. I mean, I
there's that. Yeah.
I know there was was it 20 years of Homestar Runner or something along those lines? And it's just, I immediately, it's not the same by any stretch, but I think of that as like, that was my era's underground comics, because it was a Flash cartoon, but it was indie. Like I even know people my age who were hanging around me and were in my circles that missed it completely. So it's not
mainstream.
It's not mainstream at all. And I guess if you were in the room when we were watching it, maybe you liked it or you didn't. But if you didn't like it that one time, you were not going to crowd around when a new one came out with us. And so you'd never remember it. It's that one thing
Yeah. It's that thing that it's like, oh, this is under the radar for most people, even if at that time when Homestar was running, where it's like, even if you were like very internet savvy, anything could be under your radar. So like the fact that you ran into somebody who, caught a reference to something like that, it's like following an indie band scene and, walking around with a t-shirt and someone going, oh my God, you listen to them too. It's very much like that.
Yeah.
I mean, look, the first time I walked into a comic shop and it was like, yeah, sure. Like, I was probably like, 10 or so, or maybe a little older, not much. And at that time, yeah, sure. It was Marvel DC, but it was like, what is all this other stuff? Like, I didn't even know that there were other things, because sure, like you might see one of these kinds of comics in the wild, but you just don't, you don't know the scene. You don't know the world and the era. But
even a comic shop is mostly going to have the big two anyway. So without having what I would consider the right comic shop or the older brother, some of this stuff is like an indie band. it will never cross you'll go through your whole life and not know it.
Yeah. Most of the stuff at that time was self-published too. Like, like it was either something like, this magazine that these were collected in, probably I think by a group, but like a lot of like other like indie publishers at the time were either like, hey, like I just want to make it myself, and so I'll just do it completely myself. Or like there were some guys like, throughout the country that like owned comic shops, and then because they would see people coming in who could write and draw, but just, they weren't getting work at a publisher, they would like start their own little imprint. And I think First Comics and a couple of them started like that. They're not around anymore, or they've been absorbed. But yeah, there was always like this undergroundness to almost anything outside of, it's like when you go to a record shop for the first time, and like, if that's your scene, and it's just like, oh, like, sure, like I knew that there was more, but I just didn't know there was this much. And that also, like, it was all so different than the mainstream stuff I knew.
So the first time you pick up Mouse,
yeah,
is it the cover? Because this is the first. This might be the only thing in my entire house, and I would say this is probably true of a lot of people,
right?
With a swastika on it, like,
yeah, fair enough.
It's a bit,
it
doesn't hide what it is.
No, it kind of jumps. The cover kind of jumps out at you a little bit. So for me, because this had already been published when I started getting into comics, I just kept on seeing it referred to, as one of the best things and award-winning thing in comics. Like if you're, these lists of like, what's the best stuff, you know what I mean? Or the most like, worthwhile things to read in comics, you know what I mean? Mouse was always in those conversations on those lists. And so eventually at some point I got a hold of a copy. But one of the things that, like, because I was just like so into comics as a medium, even in of itself, like I always had like this insider outsider pride of like these certain aspects of comics. And one of them was like, hey, America only has like certain things that they can consider true American created art forms. And one of them is like jazz and maybe like the blues, I think. But like comic books is one of them. Like superheroes are not like comic books. And I think maybe you could argue it, but it's usually credited as being a thing that was created here in America. So that's like a factoid that I always latched onto. And one of the things that always kind of was a thing for me was the fact that like Mouse won a Pulitzer. So to me, that was like a recognition of the art form in and of itself.
It's transcending just spandex, basically.
Yeah, like besides the content and the material of the story, the fact that like, oh, someone actually took that serious. Like, because like I was reading comics when comics was still very much, I mean, they probably still are to a large degree now, kind of like dismissed almost outright as a form.
Yeah.
Like, you know what I mean? Because it's just carries all this baggage from the 50s forward of being a kid's thing, that nothing serious or worthwhile
comes out of
it comes out of it. And so the fact that something won a Pulitzer and it's like, well, it happens to be about like, the Holocaust and Nazis in Germany and survivor stuff. So like, it makes sense that it would. And so like, I always kind of knew it was on my list of a thing that I had to get my hands on at some point. You know what I mean? So I don't know if I ordered it special through the comic shops that I was going to at the time, because it had probably a reprint, or if I found it maybe at Barnes and Nobles or something like that. But that was like my drive for wanting to read it. Didn't really know a lot about it. I'd seen maybe a couple of panels in those kinds of magazines or publications that were talking about it. And it was always pointed to as, hey, if you want to read something and get a little history lesson at the same time.
Yeah, here you go.
I will say that like, it's probably one of the only things I've read about the Holocaust experience.
So can I ask then, based on timing, would you have read this before you watched Schindler's List? Would this have been your first so this was your first like real dive into that conflict that side of that conflict other than like when it started and when it ended based on like what our history lessons would have been with just facts and figures.
Yeah. Yeah. Like for me, like all I had going on was like the exposure to like, the skimming kind of through history that you get out of high school, school, where we're covering World War II at school, and they, we'll talk about it, but we're not getting too crazy deep.
Yeah.
And then maybe, for some people, this will be different than others, but like, and then maybe like in your English classes, because you're reading a certain book, you will
discuss
then get into maybe some of the heavier elements of it. But like, they're jamming so much, world history. We ain't got time to get into all of it. So we're just like, for me at the time, but.
So for me, I have met survivors and I've heard firsthand survivor stories, but I've also heard the, we were thankful not to be in the old country stories or,
sure.
So it's weird because like, obviously growing up Jewish, Schindler's List is like, well, I've heard that story before. Maybe not that one, but like, it's like, oh, your great grandfather's here because, of an Italian who did a thing, or like because of a Swede who did a thing. Like there's so that part of it's not unique. And that was the weirdest part about reading it. It might be why it took me a week to read. It's because I was like, okay, I've heard this before. And most of it was like people within like a Jewish community I was in when I was much younger, and there were more survivors alive, or like, you'd be at a summer camp, a Jewish summer camp, and they'd have a survivor come and talk or whatever. But I'm reading this going like, I've heard this before. Like I haven't heard this one before, but like it feels so familiar because all those stories. And then the other thing, this was the thing that got me the most, is the way he wrote his father is the way that generation and the generation under it told stories.
Right.
It's something about the way he wrote the text that he got the pacing. I couldn't do it. Like I couldn't write it, but but if somebody were to talk like that, I'd be like, that's my grandmother, or like that's so-and-so. Like I know, I can hear a very specific kind of old Jewish person.
It's on display here, and I'm just going to speak as if I know firsthand, but there is a curt matter-of-factness as a shorthand in a way that they talk about a lot of things and anything to each other that is all contextual with their old days during that, what I mean? So like, it's been a long time since I read it, and thankfully, because I skimmed the wiki, this is easily at the top of my brain, but like, the opening chapter, we'll call it sequence, because it's broken up into like all these section, small chapters that got published, piece by piece. But the first one has to deal with like, he's Art Spiegelman as a kid is with his friends, and they're down by the lake or the ice or something like that, and his friends all ditch him. And when he runs to tell his father's like, friends, like your friends, you lock them together in a room and let's see how long like you guys all stay as friends. And it's like a weird thing, like, because the kid doesn't have like that full context of like, what do you mean by like locking them in a room together? And like, the dad means it in a very different way. But because the book does this thing where it jumps forward and backward in time of him present day, remembering those kinds of conversations of things being like only half explained to him and so implied, and so much of it kind of like going over his head as a kid, but a lot of it not. And like, because the adults are doing that thing that adults tend to do in general, which is around kids, which is that like when you get to a certain age and they don't realize what is going over your head or is not going over your head anymore, but they're still kind of talking to you and around you of like, I'm going to talk to you like this and you'll get it one day, or the adults are going to talk to each other and we don't think you're going to get it, and we're going to talk around you anyway. and like be damned if, this kid's going to piece anything together. But, that's a good portion of the story. And
then the other
mm-hmm.
like very important section, I think,
Mm-hmm.
which kind of piggybacks on that, is the end where he's trying to draw the story out of his dad, because he'll get sidetracked. Like he was like, hey, no, like what happened when you were in Warsaw? He's like, well, but about that other no. Like
Dad doesn't want to, and for all his kvetching about it and spontaneously bringing it up, when he's asked about it,
like
it's the last thing. Like he wants to consciously sit and discuss with his now grown adult son, who's like coming.
I think there's a part of it too where, and this is not cultural. This is maybe creative, like a creative regret. Like podcasting didn't exist for me, 22 years ago when I lost my last two grandparents within a span of 8 months. But I think like, and I've had my parents on the show, and that's important to me. If for one of a different time, I would have had my grandparents on, because there are, I see within the comic Art trying to get his dad to tell stories. And I know that if I don't get my parents back on mic, even if it's not for the show, to tell me stories that they remember from my grandparents, my kid's never going to hear those stories, because I don't know enough of them. I only know like a few humorous anecdotes, but I don't know those stories. And so there's a part reading Art kind of draw out, especially in part 2, where he's trying to get the rest of the story from his dad, where I'm like, oh, the amount of stuff I just don't know about my family. And the same is true of like, there are pictures, not even like picture albums. There are pictures in my parents' house where it's like, this is 5 people from like 2 generations removed, and I know 2 of them. So there's an amount of that, which is, again, it's why volume 2 took me so much longer, because I'm like, man, like I'm never going to get these stories, or I'm not going to know. There is a point where there's a photograph and it's like, who is this? Yeah,
well, there's always that. I think in almost every family where, like, as a kid, you grew up with all this prehistory that you just don't find out about. And, sadly or interestingly, for the Jewish community, there's a lot of mutual history, tied around this event and these goings on, where like by default a binding element.
Yeah.
You mean that, like, me, Christian, Catholic, whatever the frick, I don't even remember. I'm so far removed from it. But like, I guess Irish Catholic, you'd have to lump me in. But like, I don't have this particular cultural thing or anything remotely like that. Or, and in some ways, like, I think some people might have like immigrant story and immigrant history kind of thing to kind of bring them together. But those things don't bring any, well, not always anyway, I should say. Less often, they don't have uncomfortable baggage baked all the way in, which makes like having the conversations.
We like to add to it too. We love to add to it, because so there's a part where one of Spiegelman's cousins, brothers, whatever, goes to Israel. And it's like, well, why don't you just go? So we're talking about a very bad thing and people who survived, but there is in every family, well, so-and-so went to the Holy Land. Why didn't you? And so we like to add these levels of guilt to the story because someone within the family or extended family did a thing, and how come you didn't? Right. And I know the cliche is like, so-and-so is going to be a doctor or a lawyer.
Right.
But there's also the so-and-so did go to the Holy Land, or so, like, it's just like all these, we add so many extra layers to what is already a very defined, like, cultural unifying thing, that we made it a circle. It's not a dot anymore, because everybody's got a this, a that, or a cousin, an aunt, an uncle. Like,
it's never simple.
Yeah, we add to it. So like every time he takes an aside, Spiegelman's dad, I'm like, oh, I've heard this too. Like it's not just the Survivor story I've heard, which is anyway. Look, we started at the top. There were 2 books, and one of them is slightly more uplifting than Mouse, but not by much. By the way,
sure, yeah. It's not as heavy and deep. We could say that,
but it is dark.
I would like to say, are we shifting gears?
We have to, because if we don't,
I want to say for anybody that's like remotely curious who's listening, there are things to appreciate about the art form. I would like people to experience
in Mouse
that are transcendent of the art form.
Okay.
So there's like this meta component to it, as you know, it's quasi biographical. Art Spiegelman's unpacking his own life and his own experience with his dad through this thing. It's a great example of how to understand comics, I guess you could say. Like, quietly and simply, it's doing a lot of things you can only do in comic books. So like there's the representation of the Jews as mice and the Nazis as cats. It's this anthropomorphized kind of thing it's got going on. It helps to soften the heaviness to a degree.
It also kind of ratchets up a little bit of the lightheartedness when the Jews wear cat masks to be Germans. Like
the fakers, or the ones hiding amongst, right?
Yeah.
So there's this cleverness like that comes into how the story is told.
Yes.
So that it is, in case anyone gets the sense that it is a heavier than we're describing.
It's not nearly as heavy as I put it in my brain as while I was putting it off for many, many years.
Yeah.
Which is why when Bill sent me the second book, I put it at the top of my list because I was like, I'm not going to do this again. But we know, if anybody's listening, this podcast is the reason, and conversations from this podcast, maybe not a specific episode, is the reason that Bill sent me The Eyes of the Dragon by Stephen King. Because I think it was on this show, but I know in private when we just talk on the phone, I had said, I'm not really a horror guy, which I've said on this show many, many times. So I didn't think I'd ever have a reason, because I don't know enough about him. So I didn't know he wrote fantasy.
Right.
And so I was like, and you were like, well, here's this one.
The 1 or 2 times that he did. Well, here's it as my coming to suggesting this as I remember it.
Okay.
So when we were talking about that, we were talking about general authors, or the fact that we both have read some Clive Barker. And so the fact that we had that as a mutual thing, but I thought it was interesting that you have read some Clive Barker stuff, who is and was touted for the longest time as the successor to Stephen King as far as horror goes. And Clive Barker's horror stuff, or most of his regular stuff, is just like headier and like more verbose in a way, superfluous sometimes in his execution and style. And I was just like, well, I'm very surprised that you haven't read any Stephen King at some point, even like some of these things that maybe, are considered like his more easily digestible, less horror based kind of things. And you were like, well, no, it's never really like, and to me, it's like, well, you're mentioning that, like, you kind of put him off to the side because he's a horror guy. And to me, I'm like, there's no more horror guy than Clive Barker. The guy created and directed the fucking Hellraiser movie,
which I haven't watched, by the way. Like,
you know enough to know that it's whacked.
Okay. I mean, this is the other thing. This is why it's Clive Barker's our hilarious overlap, right? Because I come to him from his fantasy stuff. Sure. Which he wrote quite a bit of, and while there are maybe little bits of horror elements,
it's dark fantasy.
It's dark fantasy,
and it's weird fantasy. It's never straight.
No, that's true.
It's not knights and dragons.
That's true. I mean, I sent you Imagica, which having read that this past year, like there are some dark things in there, and and we bonded over
the Great and Secret
Show.
The Great and Secret Show, which is like just whacked outness of just, you know, a million different ideas kind of all
together,
smooshing together. And there's darkness, there's horror in it, but it's not like, you know, like straightforward thriller horror where it's like a simple Stephen King is like more of a simple setup guy, whereas Clive Barker is like, I've got an entire world that is
all of it
like it's messed up and screwy. He's much more of a world builder than King tends to be.
Yeah,
King gets like a weird idea and runs with it.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
You know, now that you say that, it's specifically like I'm thinking of Imagica, sure, but like my favorite and first Clive Barker was Galilee, and he builds at least 3 different worlds.
Exactly.
In just that book. Yeah. No,
exactly.
Let
me tell you something. Weave World is about a microscopic world that exists in your carpet.
I know.
Okay.
I know.
And
that was my second, by the way. That was my second Clive Barker.
Arabat is about like, it's like his Wizard of Oz kind of thing, but it's all based on like islands, and every island is a representation of a different hour on a clock. So there's 12 islands, and like, you know, so like he's out there, dude.
All right.
And so like, so for me to bring it back around, I was just like, oh, well, maybe what you need is a sampling of Stephen King that is not his horror stuff, or just something that definitely feels different. And to me, it was like, well, it doesn't get more different than Eyes of the Dragon, because, well, and we'll get to the story stuff, but for me, I meet that book. So my mother's the voracious reader in my house.
Okay.
And when it was like 4th grade going into 5th grade, I think Tommyknockers came out. Tommyknockers is one of Stephen King's like kind of most shat upon books.
Okay.
It was written kind of like during the heyday or the very tail end of like his drinking beer and doing coke and just writing books in a fueled frenzy that I don't quite remember much of. Is kind of like how he's quoted Tommyknockers. He's like, I don't remember writing most of that.
Okay.
And so, you know, Tommyknockers not that great. But as a kid, where like I was always reading, and so eventually was reading ahead of my grade, and my mother was a voracious reader and had no problems with me reading anything. You know what I mean? Like, just, sure, read. You know what I mean? Like, my brothers kind of read too, but not as much as I did. So she was just always kind of like, yeah, read. So all these Stephen King books would be around the house, and they've all got some crazy book cover. And so I grabbed Tommyknockers and gave it a go, but like, the book's not that great. You know what I mean? So like, it kind of loses its steam, and it's a little long, and it would have been like the longest book I had probably read at the time. So I lost steam. But at that same time, now, by the time I get to that book, The Eyes of the Dragon had just come out. So she's like, well, give this a shot instead.
Okay.
You know, have some fun with this. And so I read that, and I was like, oh, this is great. This is great. But I knew full well, because my mother was a big Stephen King fan, that this was not his typical stuff. And like, he's not going to turn into a Tolkien type guy, and all of a sudden, like, this is like, you're going to see more of this. So this is a standalone thing.
I'm sad it is. I'm so sad it is, by the way.
Yeah. So to you, I'll say, if you are interested in anything that's similar to that from Stephen King, jump into the Dark Tower stuff.
Okay.
And that's a whole separate thing, but that is his fantasy epic. That is a mashup of a lot of different genres and stuff like that. And it's his long form story. It's like 8 books, you know, and, you know, anything that length has obviously some stuff that's like, oh, you know, better off than others, but
yeah,
to get into Eyes of the Dragon.
Yeah, so, man, I'll tell you what. So Eyes of the Dragon, I did like it. Mm-hmm. But like, I immediately go to like, okay, well, that might be the darkest villain I've ever read in a fantasy thing. Like, and
yes.
like just the most evil, darkest villain, I think, in just, maybe in all of fantasy. I don't know.
He feels almost a little too dark for the story itself.
Like, you know how when like you watch Disney movies as an adult and you're like, there's no way the hero wins without a miracle.
Right.
That's the way I read Eyes of the Dragon. Like, there's no way they defeat him without some kind of miracle. This is so overpowering.
Yeah, the thing with Flag That's his name. Is that like, yeah, sure. Like he's like a 400-year-old wizard or
Yeah.
something, but he might also be the devil.
There are hints.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. There are hints.
You know what I mean? There's a lot of, beating around the bush and little like kind of like innuendos and stuff. And, to put it mildly, King was not done with Flag
Oh,
at the end of this book.
Oh God, no.
Flag rears his head, and I'll just leave it at that. In other
things,
King, other things.
Okay,
mostly Dark Tower.
Okay,
but
yeah, because it feels like the end of this book feels like the beginning. Like this feels like the beginning of a series.
Yeah, it does. Like in today's perspective, it would be like, oh, this feels like a thing that's like we're going to revisit this place.
We're coming back. Yeah.
We kind of don't really,
But I like I mean,
it's a clever, simple story that he wrote for his daughter.
Yeah, it's
weird.
At the time, it's so weird, Bill. I finished this book, and I stay away from dust jackets and back covers when I read stuff as much as possible. Because I feel like sometimes they give too much away trying to sell the story.
Sometimes the trailer gives you the whole movie.
Yeah. And so I didn't know a lot of that stuff.
Sure.
I will say, as much as I liked this book, the story of this book is fascinating. He writes it for his daughter. He writes it because he feels pigeonholed as a horror writer in relation to his
success,
the success of other types of books, and like that's all they want from him. And it's for me that's amazing, because so as an example, right, I read through all of Len Dayton's catalog. I read a few different spy series. I read nonfiction about World War II a few times. I read a weird kind of thriller-ish mystery set in Hollywood. Like, Len Dayton as an author was not pigeonholed at any point. He had series. He had a 4-series thing that was what Agent Palmer was based on, or Harry Palmer was based on. He had Bernard Sampson, and those were standalone. Then he did a whole bunch of nonfiction. And then I've got authors that I love, like Klosterman does essays, but he's also written fiction stuff. Like, I tend to gravitate. Barker's all over the map, but like I only bring this up because I've fallen in love with these authors that aren't pigeonholed, right? So and I mean, Dayton's probably the only one that kind of overlaps mostly as far as publishing dates with King.
Okay,
but it's one of the things where I look at this and I go, I just feel bad for Stephen King, because I'm like, I don't know why. Ignoring the success, but like I don't know why he would feel pigeonholed. Why he should have been a big enough name to just be like, I want to write another one of these.
Well, I'll tell you, it's only because he was the size of the writer he did that his publisher put it out. Yeah, because I think the thing too is just that, like, the more I understand about publishing, it's just that, like,
it's
your
getting
publishers
worse.
Sometimes when you've started to develop yourself will actually tell you, like, you should, like, I just watched an interview with Dean Koontz, and Dean Koontz is like, super, prolific and all that stuff. And
Koontz and Baldacci I also haven't read, so for that matter, and if you don't count the Patterson that he finished, that Crichton didn't finish Eruption and Patterson did, I've never read Patterson. Like, and now you've got me, because of this, you've got me thinking, like, well, I can sit here on mic and say I've never read Koontz, and I've never really read a Patterson, like a true Patterson or a Baldacci, and now I'm thinking, like, but Bill did find a King I liked, so like there must be an in with some of these other authors.
Well, I think there is. I think there's a thing to say about Koontz, is that he's another one who's like trying hard to not let himself get too pigeonholed, because it's like, look, it just does seem to be a thing where, like, certain writers are like, look, I don't know where the story is coming from. I'm just chasing it. And it is what it is. And if that means it's outside of my normal, quote unquote, normal genre, what am I supposed to do with it? And others stay right in their lane. You know what I mean? But what I'm going to go back to is that, like I was saying about Kuntz in this interview, was like he was saying how like he's got in his more recent years, he's developed a character named Thomas Odd. And the character has some interesting traits about him. Anybody who's interested can go look that up. But his publisher was like, you know what? This is very different. Maybe we should put this to the side. And it might not even have been Odd Thomas. It might have been something else earlier on, to be honest with you. But anyway, his publisher was like, we should put this to the side for like 7 years. And when you've built yourself up where like it doesn't matter, we could put this out. And so I think it was Odd Thomas now. So the rest of the story goes that eventually he's like, I don't know what to do with it. I'm finishing it. So if you're waiting for something else to come along sooner, I'm going to finish this up. And it pushed back. And it was like, now he's written like 8 of those Odd Thomas books, and with all of his other kinds of writings. But the point being that like he kind of like is another one where it's like he kind of is like shifting all the time. But to bring it back to Stephen King, King's kind of wrestled with this before, where earlier on he had some stuff that's collected into the Bachman books when he wrote as Richard Bachman. And the whole point with those 4 novellas was more or less that here are these kind of like grittier, not really horror, kind of like gritty thriller type things that follow like a certain kind of setup, but like I don't know what to do with them really. And
that's fair.
Hey,
is that why?
For shits and giggles, let's put them out on a smaller publisher under a pseudonym.
Okay,
and like just test the skills and see if people end up gravitating towards them in any particular way. And he gets found out, and basically some bookstore clerk kind of puts it together by the copyright pages, finds the connection in the legalese of how, oh yes, this definitely is Stephen King. Some people had already kind of suspected it.
Okay.
A couple of reviewers were like, oh, this guy's kind of like writing in that verbiage, in that wheelhouse that Stephen King tends to write in. Seems like he's very influenced by him, or is just of that ilk. And this other guy was like, no. Look, it's this copyright or this postage had. So I think exactly what the actual detail was, but figured it out. So Stephen King was like, okay, yes. We put those out. Now they can come out in a collected version of the Bachman books. But, it's Running Man, The Long Walk, Rage, and Roadwork, I think. And each, like, Roadwork is like a revenge story, I believe. Rage is a book that is a short story that he doesn't publish anymore. After Columbine, he had it pulled out. And it is basically about a young boy who kind of like takes his classroom hostage. And I remember reading that at the time because I was young, and I was kind of, like, I know why now Stephen King doesn't put it in. Sure. Because as a time I was like, oh, I get what this kid's talking about. I can relate to some of this crap that he's feeling. Like, how when you're a young guy, supposedly you read Catcher in the Rye, and it's like, oh, I get it. Then you read it when you're older, and you're like, yeah. And then Long Walk and The Running Man. Long Walk is now just being made into a movie, and we all know The Running Man. But they're not horror stories,
or not.
They're not
sequel. The remake's out now. I mean,
right? That's true. But they're not, horror stories.
Yeah, that's
and
fair.
So
yeah.
I think by the time Eyes of the Dragon was a thing, it's like, well, I wrote it for my daughter, and obviously I can survive the weathering of the fan backlash, which he did get because his fans were kind of used to, like every year he's putting out like some great horror book, Cujo and The Shining and, all these things that are very much like,
well, they're considered modern
staples.
Classics now. Yeah.
Yeah. And I don't know exactly how much of like, it's been a while since I looked at the Eyes of the Dragon. The verbiage might be a little bit more like, old English speaky.
No, it's pretty.
It's kind of not.
It's
right?
pretty standard. It's weird. The weirdest thing about it is it feels. I think I wrote this in my review, but I can't remember like what I used specifically. But like, it feels like a story you're telling. You're making up as you go along to a kid who doesn't want to go to sleep because the beginning meanders through like little by little by little, but the last. Maybe so 80% of the book is set up, but the last 20% everything happens. You're like, oh, like it's almost like if
the payoff stuff is great.
If you imagine him telling this story to his daughter, it's like, oh, oh, she's falling asleep. All right. And then this happened, and this happened, and this happened, and this happened, and this happened.
Yeah.
Like the way it's broken down, it would like in a 10 episode mini series on TV, it would be 9.5 boring, kind of meandering episodes.
It is a bit of that.
Yeah.
It is a bit of that.
But I like that because that's kind of the way stories are told to kids. Like,
but he's got just the right amount of like foreshadowing and leaving you behind the 8 ball,
and he's the narrator
in front of it.
It's written as a narrator. He gets to occasionally in a weird.
It's a little
like,
winky. It's like the voice of the narrator is a little winky. And
Princess. It's almost Princess Bride-ish, right? Like, do you want me to skip this? Like, not quite, but kinda.
Yeah. He's known to do that once in a while in certain types of stories where it's like the narrator might just break in and say, well, folks, if you're a little squeamish, you might want to skip the next little bit and jump to the beginning chapter where you'll know what happened, but you don't have to read about it if you don't want to. And like, so, and because of the nature of this particular kind of story, it's very easy to do that. Cause like you said, he's doing a very deliberate narrator who does get a little winky and is a little bit like, oh, and that's when Peter started requesting things from the top of the needle. And we'll get back to that. You know, because that's what he does. He's like, and, you know, maybe we'll explain why he's doing that, folks. Yeah. And meanwhile, it's like, okay. But he does that just enough where, you know, not that the story is like really that languid because it's not a long book, but it does position characters where it's like, oh, like our hero is actually like trapped in a steeple for most of the story, and that's not our hero. Oh, our hero is supposed to be the little kid, and we're gonna follow that kid. How is that kid gonna stop the evil, crazy, dark wizard? You know what I mean? But like, so like when you talk about the Princess Bride, it is of that ilk.
Yeah,
it's a good amount less comedy. And it's a little bit more grown up. So,
but
like,
not
I would
enough.
say,
like you're talking about, like maybe Princess, like as an example, if Princess Bride is for 8-year-olds, this is only for 10-year-olds. It's not.
Yeah.
It's degrees. Like there's a lot. You know, you grow up a lot in those 2 years, but
yeah, you can. You know. But I would even say maybe even a little bit older, but like not by a whole lot. But I get what you're saying. And
so I'm two for.
And that's the fun of it.
So you're 2 for 2, Bill. You got any others?
I probably do. You know what I mean? We'll have to wait and see, but I think I could cook something up. But I think my interest would probably be to give you another Stephen King book, because the assignment that I took upon myself with this was to loosen you up just enough where I could get you to read something like Cujo or some other book. He's got so many books that my brain was like, The Dark Half, the Talisman, 60 books just flashed before my eyes. But something that's a little bit more horror, but not as like, you know, I think the reputation, because he leaned into it so hard back in the days.
Okay.
You know, especially with like, you know, the American Express cards and ads and all this kinds of shit. And like, he's got no problem with being like the creepy smile and the lightning in the background. Hello, I'm Stephen King. Like, you know, and it's like, oh, okay, creepo. So like people like just think it's all hard blood and guts, you know, kind of thing. And then you get the movie versions, which are like these condensed things, and you forget sometimes that like, oh, you know, the books of anything are always better because, you know, there's more to it that it gets left on the floor. Like,
yeah,
because as much as like Cujo is about the dog, the story's not about the dog. You know, the story's about the mother trying to protect her kid the whole time. And so like, it's a thriller for sure, but it's a survival tale kind of thing. You know what I mean? And Stephen King's greatest trick is making you believe his characters, and that when you're in their heads, like you're in their heads, you know?
Okay.
And so it is a thing where it's like, you know, a lot of times the setup be damned, but he's the king, you know, he's the pro at it, like a simple setup. And I think his true strength comes from the fact that like he broke his bones. I mean, well, he did, but I mean, he made his bones writing short stories. So his muscles were developed in a way that's like concentrated ideas, but the ideas tend to be really kind of like, I've got a hook of an idea, and how do I unpack that? Whereas like, you know, somebody else is like, oh, like I want to write a character study about a type of person who does X, Y, and Z. And meanwhile, he's like, I want to write about the fucking vampires, but I want it to be like my version of vampires. Sure. But he does the same magic of unpacking realistic characters that are just like, oh, they talk like real people. The descriptions and everything and the breakdowns and everything aren't like heady. And so it's like, it's not hard reading. It's not complicated reading. He's not like a guy where like, oh, every 2 pages, it's like, I got to underline that word and look it up in a dictionary later, well, really approachable.
I will say you come to me in the right space though. Right. Mm-hmm. I talk not a lot, but it comes up enough when I talk about books. Like I'm reading all the books in my house, but as anybody who's kind of collected books for long enough knows, like there's some weird crap that we collect, whether we mean to or not. And so
sure.
I think when we were having the initial conversation before you sent me Eyes of the Dragon, I had said, I'm in the best reading shape of my entire life. Right. Meaning that like I've read so many different things. I'm in a place where look, I'm not denigrating people who are like, I read romance or I read science fiction or I read fantasy, but like, because I've read so many different things by so many different authors, like I'm almost at a point now where, as far as being in reading shape, I don't think there's a book I couldn't get through. Yeah.
I think that's also too why, like, I kind of feel like it's easy for me to feel comfortable with suggesting anything to you. Because you do read like this broad spectrum of types of book, as opposed to people who kind of like, and my mother, God bless her, like, only really was reading horror, paperback horror, thrillerish kind of stuff, maybe I think some real thrillery kind of like Patterson and these kinds of guys at a certain point, you know what I mean? Because she was so voracious, she was just like, oh, I'll just start reading this guy too. I'll start reading that guy too. Like you just,
Oh, I mean, there are definite, like, I mean, like that's one of the reasons I'm kind of thankful that not every author I really like's prolific, but it's a slippery slope because
well, you were also seem to be like, when you kind of start to like one of them, you turn into a completist where it's like, well, he's only got 35 books. I could read them all.
Yeah. No, my next potential completist author is just insane.
Why? What is that?
My second. So a long time ago, I read The Source by James Michener. And this past summer, I read Chesapeake and I loved it. And now I remember loving The Source too. But Michener's, we're talking about like maybe 700 plus books, like 700 plus page books, right? Like, God. And there's like at least 50. I mean, I don't know. Like, and they're all, I know they're all like really in depth and really good.
Sure.
And I have similar to what I did with Barker, where I just got a lot of books, maybe like 8 or 10. I did the same thing when I was trying to get one specific book from Michener, where it was like, oh, I can buy it by itself for $20, or I can get it in a lot of 8 for less. Like, all right,
what a deal! How do you resist?
Here we go. But like, if I do decide to sink my teeth into him at some point, it's like, oh, but like, I thought Dayton was long, and like I thought Barker had a lot of stuff, and it's like, no, not really. Like, I mean, nobody can see it, but behind me. In my office,
I can see it.
Is my collection of Douglas Copeland, but like he's not writing 500 word books. The difference is maybe 4 of the Copeland books are similar in that they're novels, but everything else is kind of like just whatever he wants to write. And I think this goes back to a little bit of me feeling bad for Stephen King and being a little bit, even tying it to Mouse, where he was dealing with his own success. One of the reasons that I try my very best to keep the blog as open as possible and the podcast as open as possible, so I can have these conversations with you or have a stranger on or talk business or music or whatever, is because I don't want to get trapped. Because I'm very aware that like if I was a Stephen King type and I got typecast into a specific thing, I would just end the podcast. Like, you can only talk to this kind of person. I'd be like, I think I'm done. right? Like, and so
Yeah.
not trying to tie it all up, it just kind of comes out this way. It's just like, that's where I'm at right now. It's like, all right, well, like, let's talk to different people. Let's read different things. Let's try and,
and that what I think too is an interesting thing to kind of like pack it up to is to say, like, what I like is the fact that, like, we covered 2 books that couldn't be more different.
Yeah.
And from 2 creators that couldn't be more different. But what they do have in common is they've both had careers that, like, they got to express themselves in their medium any which way they wanted to.
Yeah.
So with Stephen King, people, always surprised to find out, oh, he wrote Shawshank Redemption and he wrote Stand By Me and The Green Mile, which is, more fantastical, but it's like, and that, like, his short story collections are not always just horror short stories. The majority of them are, especially the older stuff. But, like, The Life of Chuck that just came out, which is, a mixed bag movie maybe, but, like, a short story that's, like, a very semi-literary, like, you know what I mean? And and with Art Spiegelman, I need to be reminded of this by watching this documentary.
I still got to watch that doc. I still got
the PBS put out, but, like, he made this, and he's also, like, the brain behind Garbage Pail Kids. And folks, if that doesn't make you want to watch the PBS doc that's available on YouTube, you know what I mean? And so
that moves, like, that up to the top of my list though now.
But it just goes to show, like, don't throw away your ideas because some idea you have because it exists outside of what you normally creatively do, So, like, hey, maybe you will do nothing with it, but chase it down, make a thing out of it. If it ends up in a drawer, it ends up in a drawer. Some of King's best stuff sat in the drawers for 20 years, and then he finally pulled it out and was like, yes, this does read like crap, but there's good ideas in here. Let me rework it, and, revitalize some of his stuff. And, for someone like Spiegelman, like I said, you run through his career and stuff, and it's like, well, here's a lot of, like, jovial, fun shit. And then, like, most known for, a serious examination of the Holocaust amongst his family, But these are the kinds of things I think that make following certain creators and the creative endeavors in general so worthwhile, is just that, like, over a course of someone's lifetime as a creative, you'll just get to see variations.
That is the exact reason why when I do get, like, really, really interested in an author or an artist, I go all in, because most of the time, man, that journey from wherever you start to wherever you finish and all the zigs and the zags in between, like, it's very rarely a straight line.
Right.
And if you like them, it's always worth the ride.
Always. Because at least you learn something, even by something that's like, oh, like, okay, this was a little bumpy spot in their career. But, like, if you appreciate the process or the development of someone over the course of their lifetime, it's like, okay, great. Like, I got to take a sampling of this era or this point of their life or career where it's like, okay, maybe didn't hit on all cylinders, like,
but I know why what came next. So
exactly. Right.
First, let me reiterate what Bill just said. Don't throw away ideas that seem odd to be coming from you. You can do more than one thing. I know it seems odd in today's content world where everything needs to be done for a reason other than the fulfillment of doing a thing, but that is hustle culture run amok, and you don't have to buy into all of that. You can just do something because you want to. That's it. And do you know what else you can do? You can give your friends reading recommendations, but you can also go one step further and just send them the book. Sure, maybe some of you will put off reading for years what you could just read today, but I think it's more likely that you won't wait as long as I did for Mouse. Bill is not just a great friend of the show, he's a great friend of mine. But that he thinks I might like something and goes out of his way to get it into my hands, which has only been twice, but that's a lot more than most other people who suggest a book and never follow up. There's something to that. I've also sent him some books too. We may or may not do so again, but let this be a lesson to you. What's the worst that could happen if you send your friend a book that you think they should experience? They could not like it, or they could not read it. I'll let you ponder which one is worse. In the meantime, thanks for listening to The Palmer Files, episode 171. And now for the official business. The Palmer Files releases every 2 weeks on Tuesdays. If you're still listening, I encourage you to join the discussion. You can find all related ways to contact Bill and myself in the show notes. Bill's internet shenanigans of the past and perhaps the future can be found at wickedtheory.com. Bill Sweeney was an executive producer for this episode. The music for this episode was provided by Henno Heitur. Email and comments can be sent to this show at thepalmerfiles@gmail.com. And remember, your home for all things Agent Palmer is agentpalmer.com. All right, Bill, do you have one final question for me?
Yeah. Since we've been talking about writing and books and stuff like that, and I know that you and I have both dabbled in writing our own stuff, and I know very well what I tend to put out when I attempt writing. I'm curious as for you, since we mentioned this on earlier, that like, you know, you've got a broad spectrum these days.
Yes.
I don't mean necessarily older stuff necessarily.
Okay.
Like where you're at now with any of that comes to mind. Do you find yourself getting ideas these days, period? And if so, like, do they tend to be more in a nonfiction type? Maybe I could write a book about this kind of thing, or into like, oh, here's an interesting idea that maybe I could do something with for fiction, or like, or maybe that's not really a thing that happens for you.
So I'll start with this, right? Jason Zapata has continued to bother me as far as why
I hate when friends bother me to do things I want to do.
Oh, let's not go there, Bill.
You're not the only one who does it to me. But anyway.
Yeah, I did. Just to peel back the curtain, I think it was a couple days ago. I gave Bill 2 hours on like when are you gonna start building stuff again?
When are you gonna get your crap together, man?
So no, Zapata, you know, I'll be the first to admit that usually I try and blow him off as much as possible and just like let him say his piece and move on to whatever's next. But honestly, It is a bit of like a brush off where my answer to him, because he's like, how come you haven't written any poetry? Like, you haven't written any verse at all, right? Mm-hmm. Or even, and he's read some of the short fiction, the short stories I wrote way back. He's like, but how come you haven't written any verse? No poetry, no nothing, no fiction. And I obviously, you know, in the context of Agent Palmer, there's one. You know, I did write that 1, 2, 3, 4 challenge that we were all going to do, and I'm the only one who did it. That's a whole different thing. I did a whole solo episode about it. But so outside of that, like I haven't really written anything. And one of the reasons I call, when Zapata brings it up, I do a brush off is because originally, and one of my go-to responses was, well, I do scratch the writing itch with the blog. Anybody who's read my stuff has to know that I'm not, like I do, it is a little artistic. Like there is a little bit of a flair for, sometimes I'll use some alliteration where it's completely unnecessary. Or, you know what I mean? Like just things I will do. And I'm not talking about titles. I will do that in the paragraph, in like paragraph 5 of 12, right? Like,
you're having fun with it.
So some of it is, and genuinely, it's not a brush off. Some of it genuinely is, I get it out by writing, you know, just like, how come you always paint, flowers? Like, well, I don't feel the itch to paint anything else. But
well, that's the thing I used to say about the podcast too, was that like during that whole period, I didn't have a lot of creative inspiration
Okay.
or pull because I was doing the podcast, which was a facsimile in a way. It was
Of
satiating all those things. I got
yeah.
to do a little graphic design. I got to hang out with friends.
So,
So I get that aspect.
but I will say, because I've come clean with it, even though thank God there's no dates and deadlines. Uh, as we're recording this, I don't, and probably when it releases, we're about 2 years removed from me getting the first riff for a song that I wrote music to, and
Sure.
there are now more songs.
Okay.
There are no lyrics to this yet, but again, I do want to make an album at some point. So that came out of nowhere. So apropos of nothing, right? Like the blog's, decades old. The podcast is, getting up there in age. We're, in triple digits for things. And all of a sudden I just find some weird riff or a collection of chords. And now I have like 5 songs I'm technically working on.
Right.
I wasn't searching for it. It just kind of happened. Like up until that point, it's not like I wasn't playing guitar, but I'd play like a song like by someone else that you would hear on the radio or something, right?
Yeah,
So
you were like learning a riff or whatever.
it just came out, right? No, completely left field. In fact, I had unwittingly kind of went down the path of creating 3 different riffs that I was like, these don't belong together. These should all be separate pieces of art, I guess.
Yeah.
And it was like, all right, well, I always kind of thought about maybe doing it, but now it's like, oh, well, now I have some pieces. I have the groundwork for like 3 tracks. Like if I put 12, if I get 12 of them, I can put out like but it comes out of absolutely nowhere.
That's
in
great,
fact, the fact that I have 3, well, now I have, I don't know, 5 or 6, it like still beyond me, right? Like I wasn't looking for it. It wasn't like you and Zapata were like, how come you don't write your own music, right? Like,
right. It's not like it wasn't always like a continuous hobby of yours that you were kind of like always chasing. It's like, it feels very kind of, like you said, apropos of nothing in a way where it's like, oh, I'm not known to be the guy who like comes up with songs and writes music.
Yeah.
I mean, it's always been a skill you could have. So it's just, I love to hear it. I love to hear it,
But to that same extent, I do, because I edit Zapata's stuff. And so I do get it. And look, maybe some of that, and I'm not blaming him. And I love editing his stuff because I think the collaboration that we have as like maybe poet and editor, I don't think you'd get anywhere else. Right. And I can, he sent, as an example, he sent a text message to me and my wife with like 3 lines. And I sent him back a note. He wasn't looking for an edit, but I just sent him back a note like, hey, if you change these 2 words or one of these 2 words, it makes it more personal than the collective you're talking about. And in the end, at the time, he went with my edit. He made it more personal. And so I get a little bit of collaboration as far as being in verse with him and thinking about that. There is a part of me that would love to get back to it. I did try journaling. That wasn't for me. So I don't know. I guess my answer to you is that I'm not against any of it. I'm open to it, but it's going to come from wherever the hell that music came from. And I wasn't looking for it. And I don't know where, so yeah, I'm sure.
But that's there. And that's as good as the answer that I was kind of hoping for. Like, in the back of my head, I was hoping for something like, once in a while I get an idea. Maybe I don't really do anything with it. But the idea that like, there is some kind of creative thing that is kind of going on here or there. Because here's the thing, like, I just kind of feel like it's one of these things where it's like, it's the old, what you take in is what you pump out. So I always used to say to my mother, you read so much, you could probably be a decent writer if you ever like wanted to like, chase it down. And, she was, but she wasn't really a writer type, a really creative type until like later on. And it was just like crafting stuff, but she had an eye for it and she never really leaned into it. But the thing I was most hoping to hear was that there was something going on, something rattling around.
I'll say this: I have gotten better in the last maybe 2 years at writing down ideas. Period. So like I have over the course of like a few documents, to-do lists, whatever, where it's there are probably 20 blog post ideas that I haven't even, or maybe I've thought about doing, or maybe some of them I did. In fact, last year I wrote my favorite Bobs, which I followed up with favorite fictional Roberts, right? Like I had some fun with it, but like though that was an idea for a while, right? And so I only bring it up to say, if there was an idea for a verse or a piece of fiction, I'm now in a place in my life where I would write it down.
Sure.
Now, it took me 6 months to get to the Bob's post. Like from when I initially had the idea to when I sat down and actually wrote it out. So, but I'm in a place where if I do get an idea for a short story, I will be writing it down somewhere. I'm not in a place in my life where I'm like, I'll remember. If it's worth remembering, it's worth I'll remember it. It's like, I don't believe that at all.
I'm the same way. I'm the same way these days.
I write it all down. If I get an idea for a verse or a short story or even a novel, I mean, I would write it down. And you know me, I work ahead as much as possible. And part of that is because sometimes I get a big post or a big solo thing or a big whatever in my teeth that I want to work on. If I'm going week to week to week, I'll never have time for the big thing, but I'm not. Like, as we sit here right now, I'm maybe a month out on the podcast and 2 months out on the blog. So if I did get a short story idea tonight when we hang up the mics and I wanted to spend time on it, I have that ability. And that's kind of the other reason that I try and work so far ahead so feverishly, is because I don't know what's going to happen. And I don't know when that inspiration's going to hit, but I also know, and maybe this is something that, like, you know, when we talk about being creative, like when it's flowing, let it out. Like just let it out. So that's probably where, somewhere in the depths of my soul, where the music came from. I would hope that, given all of the reading I'm doing, I might be able to write something other than a blog post. For now, it's enough, but I know it would be. If the question was, would I like to? 100%. I would love to write another short story or a poem. I just don't have it in me. And I won't even say it's not the time. It's just, I know what it's like to bang my head against the keyboard or the pad and paper in order to write a thing that I know I need for 5 weeks from now. To do it for something I don't know what I'm going to do with, not worth it. So if the muse comes, I will be willing, but I'm not going to force it unless I have the idea. But I'm open. I'm not, again, I wasn't, I didn't expect I'd ever be talking on mic about, like, working on writing some songs, but here we are. You know, I'm sure you'll be the first to know.
The door is always open. It's never closed.
It's always open.